Hey, I'm Dave with Sawdust Planet, and I want to show you today how to do one of the trickiest cuts in woodworking. It seems that a lot of people have problems with them, and I'm going to show you one way that I've developed that I use lots of times and you can use for all kinds of projects. Cutting a mortise for mortise and tenon, the mortise itself can be tricky because most of the time you either have to drill it out and use a chisel, or use a mortising machine, which is nice if you have one, or you can get some mortising bits and put them in your drill press and use those. But in the end, I've always found, for the most part, that I have a raggedy edge, things aren't exactly square, I always have issues with it. So I said there's got to be a way, so I came up with this, and I'm sure other woodworkers have too, but for those of you who would like a different way to cut a mortise, I'm going to use the table saw. And instead of cutting a mortise, we're going to create one. And I'll show you how that's done. First, a couple things. One, if you're going to have a project where you're going to be staining the wood and using good wood, this is poplar by the way, scrap piece of poplar I had. But if you're going to be using like oak or ebony or walnut or some other wood where you're really going to finish it and it's going to look beautiful, I want you to just consider the grain of the wood. So we cut these mortises. I'm going to show you three different mortises I'm going to cut on the table saw. But just remember, if you're doing that, is that you've got to pay attention to the grain of your wood, because what we're going to do is we're going to cut these and we're going to glue it back up, and you want the grains to match as close as possible to that. Now if you're going to paint it, or you're using plywood, you're making some shelvings or something like that, that isn't going to really come into play. In fact, you have to start out with the same board that you're going to use. You could use another piece of board to do what I'm going to show you, and then you could glue it out together. That won't really matter. But I just want to make sure that you pay attention to grain if you're going to finish this out. Now mortises, I use a mortise for a lot of things, for shelving, for garden benches, and I'll show you this wine rack that I made, and where I cut through mortise, angled through mortises in the side, and it turned out really nice. And that's why I'm creating this video, is because I got lots of questions about how did you cut the mortise, they needed help with the mortise, that it was tricky to cut. So I'm going to show you how to do it a little bit easier.
Before we begin,
the table saw.
Here's an example of where I cut 4 equally spaced 30-degree mortises in the sides of a wine rack that I was making. And these are to accept the rails that I'll use to support the racks. I did all of this on the table saw, and as you can see, the joinery that I did definitely adds to the beauty of the overall piece.
So first thing we're going to do in this particular piece of wood, this is going to be my side panel. I'm going to cut a mortise into this, and I'm going to watch the grain while I'm doing it to make sure we're okay with that. So stay with me, and first thing I'm going to cut it. I'm not going to show you cutting it, because if you already have a table saw, you already know how to cut wood, so you're just watching that. So I'm going to cut a strip out of this. We're going to use that as our mortise strip. So bear with me. Okay. So what I did is I cut a 1 1/4 inch strip out of this. The width of this mortise strip, I like to call it, is going to be dependent on how wide your rail, or if you're doing a tenon on a shelf or something, how wide that's going to be. So the width of this is dependent upon what it is that you're building. For my wine rack, my rails that I had put through here, cut the mortises for, were 2.5 inches wide. I did this at 1 1/4 inches today. Like I said, my wine rack that you see in the pictures there, those were 2.5 inches. So now that I've cut this strip, this is 1 1/4 inches. This becomes what I like to call my mortise strip. And next thing I'm going to do is, on my layout, my plan, and hopefully you have one, is you know the distance between your mortises. We're just going to do one today, but if you were going to do several, if you're going to space them equally, then you would need spacers that distance to do that, and I'll show you that in just a second. So the next thing we're going to do is cut. This is a through mortise, a rectangular or square. This will be a rectangular through mortise at 1 1/4 inches. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and I'm going to cut this piece so as to create a space. And I can do that on my table saw using my miter gauge, or I like to do it on my chop saw, which is a little bit easier. So let me cut this piece, and then I'll show you how that fits together. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken my mortise strip and I measured down, and you would too, as to where you need that first mortise, and I cut this strip. When I put it back together, I can create a mortise. My rails that are going to slip through this are also 1 1/4 inches thick, same as what I cut this strip as. And so now all I have to do is line this up. I can put in my rail. And now I have, when I glue this up, and I would use clamps and glue, and I would glue this together, back together, and I end up with a perfect mortise. I will glue this up, sand it down, and I have a perfect mortise without any edges that are chewed up. It's perfectly rectangular. So this will slip through there, glue it in place, and I'm done. And you can use this method for many different things. And I've used it for my wine rack and for garden benches and other things that I've made. And it's just a lot easier and quicker for me to do it this way than it is to do the old-fashioned. Now, will this method work for every mortise that you need to cut? No, it will not. But for many things you'll build, it is a quick and easy way for someone who doesn't have the other tools to be able to cut a through mortise, rectangular through mortise. So you can space this out then. You can use these as spacers and put the next one in and the next one in, like I did for my wine rack. And my wine rack was an angled through mortise. And that's what I'll show you next. Okay, now that you know how to do a through mortise, a rectangular or square, and you can make that any size you need to make it for your particular project, I'll show you how to make an angled one. That's what I had to do for the wine rack that you see. So I had to do 4 rails across, and I set the saw at 30 degrees, which Mary can show you here. My saw is set at 30 degrees, and I cut. When I did that, I'm using a scrap piece of lumber. I'm just using a scrap piece of plywood that I used just to be able to show you this, but it would be whatever you're going to do for your rail. But I cut it at 30 degrees so that when I place it on the rack, that it's at the right angle for this one. Now, the degrees that your shelf may be or your rail may be could differ, but I just happen to use 30 degrees on my wine rack. So I cut my rails at 30 degrees, set the saw accordingly, and cut those. Now, this is 1 1/4 inches wide, just for demonstration purposes. The one thing you have to remember is that this is going to go on your piece of wood with your rail strip at 1/4 inches. But because of the angle, the mortise, the mortise strip is going to have to be a little bit more narrow than that. So I cut my mortise strip. I cut these at 30 degrees, the same as I cut my rail. So they're the same at 30 degrees. So I place this in here. It's going to work the same way. Now what I need to do is cut this part of my mortise strip at 30 degrees, and I'll do that right now. So I also cut my mortise strip at 30 degrees, and now you'll see, as Mary kind of zooms in on this a little bit, is that there's a gap between this. And that's because, even though this is 1 1/4 inches, because of the angle, this is going to be a little bit narrow. So, no problem. I know what that's going to be now. I can put this strip back on the table saw and cut it down, and this happens, I have just happened to know that this is 1 1/8 inches. If I cut this about 1 1/8, it will fit perfectly in here, and you'll have the same thing, and I'll show you that right now. Okay, now I have a through mortise that's angled at 30 degrees. And again, I use this as my spacer because that's the same size as my rails. And I glue it up together, sand it down, and cut it to size. And here's a note on that. Is when I'm building stuff like this, I like to try to make things, if I need a certain width or a certain length, I try to be able to give myself a little extra. And then when I'm finished, I cut it down to the exact size I need. If you're trying to do it straight off the bat, I mean, just exact your pieces exactly the width you want. When you start doing this, you got to remember, you got to take in the width of your blade. You got to consider that in your cutting pieces and things like that. So just a word of caution on that. But here we have a through angled, perfectly. And then if you see this joint, when it's a finished piece, it's just exactly the way you need it. It's a really super way to cut an angled through mortise. Now, last I'm going to show you is a stop mortise. You can do the same thing. If you don't want to, it's not going all the way through. It's going like halfway in. You're going to glue it in place. I'll show you how to do that on the table saw. Okay, you probably noticed that I don't have my safety guard on my saw, and I did that purposefully so that you can see what I'm doing. So you don't have to write and tell me that I should use my safety guide. I already know that. So what we're going to do is a stop dado, and what I did is I marked out the thickness of my rail that would go in between these two pieces. I'm going to do a stop dado right there. And so what I need is the thickness, is to create the dado in here for the stop more, the thickness of this, which is about 3/4 of an inch. So I've marked my piece for that, and I will cut that out on the table saw again, carefully, and I'll show you how that works. All right, here's a stop mortise. All I did was cut a dado, the width of that. I can put it in my piece, set it in, and now I have a perfectly aligned dado. Glue it up together and finish it out, and I have my stop dado. Pretty cool. I realize that was a little quick, but if you review the video, go through it again, I'm sure if it's not clear before, that it will be after you watch it a couple times. But basically you can see how you can do that on a table saw and have perfect mortise joints, and even mortise and tenon joints. And we haven't talked about tenons, that's a different story, but I'm just talking today about the mortise itself. So hopefully that inspires you, it gives you some ideas that you can use for your own woodworking projects. Again, you can do a stop dado like this, a stop mortise, you can do a through mortise, and you can do an angled one right on your table saw and have excellent results. So join us at Sawdust Planet, and hope to see you in the shop again soon.